Nous sommes ici comme les 3 députés du Parti vert du Canada ici dans la Chambre des communes et nous avons préparé et aussi nous avons eu une rencontre avec le ministre des Finances Bill Morneau avec notre effort de donner les bonnes idées vers le prochain budget du gouvernement du Canada. So we have put together our pre-budget submission and have met with Finance Minister Bill Morneau to discuss items in this submission. That's why in the press release of today's date, February 20th, we include the letter and submission that was presented and discussed with Minister Morneau on February 5th. We wanted to give the Finance Canada some time to also digest our ideas. Pour nous, c'est clair que nous sommes dans une période d'urgence climatique et on doit changer l'approche budgétaire aux causes de changement climatique et l'urgence climatique. C'est clair qu'avec les mots de Mark Carney, l'ancien gouverneur de Banque du Canada, et je cite, la préoccupation est de savoir si nous allons passer une autre décennie à poser des actions louables, mais pas assez significatives. Nous allons très vite passer la barre des 1,5 degrés Celsius d'augmentation globale. We are running out of time, and increasingly around the world, finance ministers are now playing a key role in fighting global warming. At the Madrid COP25 conference, in which I participated as a member of the Canadian delegation, finance ministers also met for the first time, and they looked to a number of measures that need to be taken around the world, and they will be meeting again at COP26 in Glasgow. So there's an increased role for ministers of finance in finding ways to avoid global climate disaster, which really is when if we cross the line to global runaway global warming, which becomes self-accelerating and unstoppable. The stakes literally couldn't be any higher than this. But what it means is that the fiscal horizons, financial planning also has to change. We're looking at risks that are of an existential nature, of an existential threat. And globally, through the OECD, through the World Bank, through a number of financial institutions are coming forward things like the Helsinki Principles to align all practices and policies of the finance ministers to meet the Paris Agreement goals, resulting in effective carbon pricing, removing all subsidies to fossil fuel industries, and basically to start planning for an orderly transition away from fossil fuels. There are risks, massive risks to budgetary planning that come from climate and come from the emergency in which we find ourselves. These changes, these threats to financial planning are being overlooked in Canada, in my view. When you look at the updates on our financial health of Canada, with state of our economy, in the last update last fall, there's no mention of what climate risk means, what it means to have stranded asset, what it means to have unburnable carbon. We need to start planning now for the orderly phase out of the fossil fuel industry in Canada, the protection of workers, and the many budgetary items that will be key in that transition. We also, of course, spoke to Minister Morneau and make many other areas of concern in our submissions. But I just want to mention one because I have my red dress pin here. Many of these issues are cross-cutting. So if we were serious about reading the report and taking away the messages of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we'd recognize that key in their vulnerability is the complete absence of safe and affordable public transportation over much of Canada. Key to fighting climate change is to have affordable public transportation, preferably with electric vehicles, across Canada. Key to protecting Indigenous women and girls and vulnerable populations is to avoid placing what the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls called man camps, which is referring to the construction camps, particularly for pipelines. We're in a crisis right now in this country over conflicts between Indigenous rights and large-scale projects. some of the messages that we're transmitting through this budget document attempt to provide solutions that are also equally cross-cutting. At this point, I'll turn the microphone over to Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith, Paul Manley.
Thank you. So one of the key things that we're talking about in this document is putting people in the planet first. And part of that is our healthcare system. Our healthcare infrastructure is aging. The federal government has not been involved in healthcare infrastructure funding for quite a while, so we're calling on the federal government to step up and put money into the Building Canada Fund for healthcare infrastructure and a disaster mitigation and adaptation fund as well. Our hospitals are the front line for disasters, for floods, for fires, for adverse weather effects that we're going to be feeling from climate change. Also, our healthcare system, because these buildings are old, they're a major contributor to greenhouse gases. So 11% of our public infrastructure energy is used in our healthcare system, and it contributes about 5% of Canada's greenhouse gases. 48% of our hospitals are over 50 years old, and in our cities it's about 69%. So we're calling on the government to put money into infrastructure funding, to allocate that funding so that the provinces can get on board and get some of these hospitals and healthcare facilities upgraded. And whether that's in the Halifax Hospital, which is old, or the Nanaimo Regional General Hospital, which is old and needs a serious upgrade, it's a need right across this country. The other crisis that we're facing is affordable housing, and we need affordable housing that is energy efficient. The City of Ottawa has been the first municipality to declare an emergency on affordable housing and homelessness. There are 1,200 homeless people in this city of 1 million people. In Nanaimo, where I'm from, there are 700 or 800 homeless people in a city of 100,000 people. We have the highest homelessness per capita in Canada, and we need to deal with this issue. It's crucial that we provide people with a safe place to live and an energy efficient place to live. If we're going to have affordable housing, we need to make sure that we're not paying for the energy for those places endlessly down the road, and that they lower their greenhouse gas emissions. Another key crisis that we're dealing with is the crash in biodiversity. And so the plan for 25% of putting 25% of the land base and the ocean into conservation and protection by 2025 and 30% by 2030 is a good plan. And we want to see this straight across the board. In Canada, the Land Guardians program, working with Indigenous people and the Indigenous protected conservation areas, is key. Whether that's areas that have been decimated through logging in the private forests in New Brunswick, or the private forests in the ENN land grant in British Columbia, or some of the Crown lands, or just looking at what's happened in northern Alberta with the oil sands projects, where the earth is scorched. We need rehabilitation of these lands. We need to deal with this biodiversity crash that we've had in this country and around the world, and that's key to fighting climate change as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Jenica Atwin.
So I'm glad to be here with my colleagues today to talk about, our budget priorities and really highlighting the kind of people and planet first. And this is something that, we're very clear on. So there are, of course, many areas we want to see significant investment. We've included the document, but I would like to personally highlight the gaps in services for veterans. I believe there needs to be a mandate of care with investments in improving access to information and resources to ensure consistency. I would also like to see significant investments in training for service dogs to help those suffering with PTSD. We must also include horizontal communication and ensure veterans' voices are being heard. Aussitôt, en tant que nation, nous devons assurer la prospérité économique dans l'ouest du pays, au Québec, mais nous devons également investir dans une stratégie qui stimulera la croissance de l'économie en Atlantique. Il y a plusieurs défis à surmonter et ils vont continuer à s'aggraver alors que les changements climatiques continuent à s'accentuer. Que plusieurs personnes dans nos communautés continuent de faire face à la pauvreté, aux coupures dans les services de soins de santé et des occasions de développement économique qui font de plus en plus rares comparativement à d'autres régions au Canada. One of the key ways to see growth throughout the country is to empower communities to tackle their own priorities. It is municipal governments that are closest to the people on the ground and have the best understanding of their infrastructure needs. It is also the level of government best suited to take rapid action to fight climate crisis. One ask in our submission is to the minister is to increase the gas tax fund, its annual escalator from 2% to 3.5% to ensure reliable and predictable funding, enabling communities to participate more actively in their own success. Nous devons améliorer l'accès aux fonds qui appuient la réponse aux catastrophes climatiques, incluant des mesures d'atténuation des inondations. This was made a government priority to support municipalities, or homeowners and businesses, and it certainly needs to be continued. What is missing is preparedness for increased forest fires, as an example. So we need to purchase more water bombers. Finally, I would like to add that part of the Truth and Reconciliation process is putting our money where our mouth is. The government needs to invest, for example, in its new Indigenous languages law. There is excellent work going on across the nation to preserve Indigenous languages and ensure they thrive in future generations. There must be funds allocated to support this. As I mentioned, there are so many priorities that we could discuss, which is why we're making our entire submission available. But above all, our government needs to recognize that investing in people and protecting the environment is the right move for Canada. Thank you. Merci.
Et je peux faire seulement un petit résumé nos efforts, parce que c'est tellement important pour le gouvernement du Canada d'investir dans les gens et la planète. Et avec ces investissements, nous serions un pays plus fort et plus durable. So in looking at our overall submissions, we're also looking at fighting poverty in Canada and around the world. We identify the Sustainable Development Goals and urge Canada to stop being where we are right now, one of the least generous countries on earth. It's not something many Canadians know, how far we have declined in our efforts to assist the poorest of the poor. We need to go back to the status we used to have as a country that was generous. And a lot of Canadians are unaware how very far we have fallen in our support for overseas development. We need to make sure we're paying attention to public broadcasting. Interim Green leader Joanne Roberts speaks to this issue very clearly. Her career before being in Green politics, she was a CBC journalist and has very clearly in our submission, we're calling for CBC to have the resources it needs to have its news programming be advertising free. We're looking at a range of issues right across the board on healthcare, on housing, Indigenous rights, climate action, and making sure that the Canada we love is preserved and protected for future generations. Thank you very much for attending this morning. Merci à toutes et tous.